Let's go back in time to 1932 as Converse brings you historic footage of the legendary original Celtics with whom all great professional teams are compared.
We have now taken over your radio.
Richie Guerin is about to show you the most important step in getting past a man. It's the first one.
And Oscar will inbound it. The men in green, the Milwaukee Bucks, that's Alcindor against Bellamy.
Anderson has Jordan. Allen shakes free, gets two!
Gilmore on big stuff! Oh, brother. Lead Toledo artists, you get 21.
4:28 to go in the first quarter for the Cow Palace. Here's Berry.
Jordan, open, Chicago with the lead!
Hello, and welcome back to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast at HardwoodParoxysm.com. I am Jason Mann. Rich couldn't be with us this week, but we do have a very special guest returning to the show. He is a great basketball history expert, and a great pleasure to have him back on the show. Adam Criblez, welcome back, sir.
Thanks, Jason.
So we are going to talk about, we're continuing our WrestleMania series, and we are talking about the Celtics rivalry with the St. Louis Hawks from the late 1950s through the 1961. They played four finals in 5 years. Back then, the Hawks were in the Western Conference, so actually Western Division. They were not even conferences yet. And they were definitely the two premier teams of that time before the Hawks fell and the Lakers became the Western Conference powerhouse for most of the rest of the 60s. But you've been looking into the Hawks lately. What sort of the interest there, and what have you found out that you feel like is really interesting about that team?
Well, the St. Louis Hawks are kind of get a short shrift because they were in St. Louis only a few years between stops in Milwaukee and in Atlanta, and I think that even when they were in St. Louis, they kind of got overshadowed. St. Louis is very much a baseball city, and so they got overshadowed by the Cardinals even when they were here. And then by the time that they left, we were kind of on the cusp of basketball becoming a lot more popular with the rise of the Boston Lakers rivalry of the 60s and early 70s. And so the St. Louis Hawks are in many ways kind of forgotten about. And so one of my interests was obviously this unknown history. But another part of it is that I'm a professor of history in Missouri. And so lacking a professional basketball team now in the state, and my choices being either the St. Louis Hawks, who won a title in the 50s, or the ill-fated Kansas City Omaha Kings of the 70s, it was a fairly easy choice to latch on to the St. Louis franchise.
Yeah, well, unless you want to go with the Spirits of St. Louis or the St. Louis Bombers.
This is true, right? Yeah,
yes.
The NBA iterations, I should say.
Right. Yes. I think the Bombers lasted 1 or 2 seasons in the BAA. I don't even think they made the transfer over to the NBA. And then the Spirits of St. Louis, they have a documentary already dedicated to them. So there's probably not too much more to mine for
right.
them.
No, and that's a really good documentary. I have to say it's one of my favorites on the of the 30 for 30s.
Yes, absolutely. So I guess the starting point with this rivalry is the huge trade that these teams made in the 1956 offseason. The Hawks, with the second overall pick, selected Bill Russell. Russell was not selected by the Rochester Royals for various reasons that we don't need to get into, but they were not smart reasons. We'll put it that way. And even though, obviously, the Hawks trading away Bill Russell was not a good decision, they did get 2 Hall of Famers for the deal. Cliff Hagan, who was very young player who had a long, productive career, a lot of it with the Hawks. And then Ed Macauley, who had been one of the most productive players of the 50s, was kind of undermanned as a center, but was a very good offensive player, All NBA caliber, a multiple-time All NBA player, a very good offensive stats, production-wise, one of the leaders in win shares of his period. So toward the end of his career, but the Hawks did get a title out of this, and 4 finals appearances in 5 years. So even though the trade itself, clearly the Celtics won the trade by a very, very large margin. If you're told that it's one of the worst trades in NBA history, I would be skeptical of that point of view.
I agree, and I think that before doing research into this project, there's that perception that short of the Blazers drafting Sam Bowie ahead of Michael Jordan, that this was the worst front office decision in NBA history, and I think that's kind of overselling that point. The Hawks got 2 Hall of Famers for Bill Russell, and obviously there's in the 50s and 60s, short of getting an Oscar Robertson or a Jerry West or an Elgin Baylor or a Wilt Chamberlain, there's no there was no player on Russell's level. But to be able to get two Hall of Famers and, as you mentioned, a title and a couple other near misses at a title, I think that from the Hawks' perspective, they certainly justified the trade, and the owner, of course, years later was still talking about how it was still a good decision and it brought them a title, and I think it's kind of maligned as this one-sided deal when in fact it benefited both franchises. Obviously the Celtics more, but certainly St. Louis still benefited from it.
Yeah, for sure. And this series is discussed in the book Rise of a Dynasty by Bill Reynolds, and it's it's of the Bill Russell books I've read, I would put it less in the recommended list. I mean, there's definitely strengths to it and weaknesses to it, but it does do a nice job of breaking down this series, and it's basically a looking back at the series and kind of the NBA of that season. It does a nice job of kind of framing where the NBA was in the sports landscape, where kind of Boston was and where the Celtics were in that landscape, and it was not good for the Celtics in Boston. And then some good tidbits from that series as well.
Yeah, the 57 is kind of a landmark or a watershed finals. In much the same way, I think you can draw a comparison to sort of the coming of the dynasties of the Celtics and Lakers in the 80s. How this is really pretty transformative. And I know you've talked to some of your other guests in some of the last couple podcasts about how Russell and Chamberlain kind of bring about a much more popular game. And I think that kind of starts in 57. You see a lot of national interest even in the game. I was reading in one article that the timing actually ended up working perfectly for the NBA when the Celtics and Hawks first met in the finals, because it was right after spring training for baseball. So all these sports writers that were covering spring training came back to their cities and are looking for material, and this drops into their lap that you have two of the biggest cities in America at the time hosting this final series, and of course then it goes to 7 games. So I think that it's both Reynolds and Rise of a Dynasty and other historians have kind of pointed to this as a really important series that, as I talked about a little earlier, that because the St. Louis Hawks no longer exist, kind of gets pushed under the rug.
Yeah, and one thing that I hadn't thought about, but does make some sense, is that Boston and St. Louis had they had a baseball rivalry in they were in the World Series, I think, in '45. So it's been a while, but that was still at least somewhat in the minds of people, and both were strong baseball cities, and this was sort of a start of the NBA moving to larger markets. The Pistons had just moved to Detroit. In a few years, Syracuse is going to move. The Lakers are going to move to Los Angeles. So basically the smaller cities are no longer going to have teams once we reach 61, 62, or so. The NBA is going to kind of outgrow the smaller cities, so that will help with the major league perception. And just it being a St. Louis and a Boston team gave it that a little bit. And honestly, I hadn't thought about it, but this was the first finals appearance for either team, which is pretty impressive in an 8-team league. I mean, it had been a bigger league in the early years before. Basically, those teams all fell apart and they consolidated. But still, for both these teams to have been in, dating back to the BAA, had been around for 11 seasons, for neither one to have made the finals yet is a little bit of a surprise.
Absolutely, and these teams also, I think we look back and talk about all the great players on the Celtics, but that these Hawks teams were very competitive even from this first year. The Celtics, of course, had eventual Hall of Famers at pretty much every position, but the Hawks managed to not only have their superstar Bob Pettit, but also they had a couple of other players. You mentioned Cliff Hagan, and Macauley, and they had probably the most important, underrated player on their team was another Hall of Famer by the name of Slater Martin. And Martin actually matched up really well with Bob Cousy. They're both these undersized, kind of scrappy point guards. Cousy was better offensively. Martin was better defensively. And so in some ways, Martin neutralized Cousy a little bit, and that allowed the other Hawks players to compete with the Celtics. We have these clips of Bill Russell blocking shots and long outlet passes, and Cousy leading the fast break. Well, that happened against St. Louis, but it happened less because Martin was playing good D, and so I think that they really matched up well, almost position by position. Obviously, there was no one to compete with Russell, but Pettit gave the Celtics a lot of problems too.
Yeah, and they also had Jack McMahon, a guard who was another pretty stout defender, although he had his problems with Bill Sharman, which we'll get into. Jack Coleman, a forward, both had come from good Rochester teams from the early 50s, and Chuck Scher as well. Was a pretty good bruising center. They also had Alex Hannum, who was a player coach and would be the only coach other than Red Auerbach and Bill Russell to win titles between 57 and 69. So both in 58 with the Hawks and in 67 with the Sixers. And then the Celtics, this is, of course, Russell's rookie year. This is also Tom Heinsohn's rookie year, and he actually won the Rookie of the Year that season. Russell missed a good portion of the year because he was in the Olympics in Australia, so he didn't join the team until about a third of the way into the season. And he people kind of understood, even I think at that point, that he was the better player, but Heinsohn was a really strong rookie, and performed well, and he would perform very well in the series, as a matter of fact. Of course, Cousy had been the league MVP in 57 and was probably by far the biggest star in the NBA. And he was kind of the one guy who would get on magazine covers and would really get a lot of celebrity. He's probably if you talked about pro basketball, he was probably the guy that grandma could name. And that was probably about it at that point.
No, you're probably right. And so Cousy's the well-known commodity, and especially on the East Coast, where basketball was bigger. And in the Midwest, Pettit is kind of the counterpart in many ways. He was born and raised in Louisiana, went to LSU, and comes to St. Louis, and he is, along with Stan Musial, they're kind of the two big names in St. Louis sports at the time. Yeah. Really, in the Midwest, he was basketball, was Pettit.
Yeah, and St. Louis didn't have I guess they had football at that point, but they didn't have hockey yet.
Sure.
So, and those are obviously those sports are in different landscapes than they are today. Baseball, obviously, being the prime thing. I guess probably still in St. Louis is the prime thing, especially I guess with their team leaving.
Right. Yeah.
So, the other key players for the Celtics, a very young Frank Ramsey, who would be a trend center, kind of the first sixth man to kind of embrace that modern take on that role. Jim Luskadoff, who was a really tough bruiser type, was, I guess, sort of the at this point, each team sort of had a designated hatchet man who would, kind of come in and rough somebody up if that needed to happen for their team, and would throw fouls. So he kind of filled that role. Had some skill as well. Was really a big muscular guy. And then Andy Phillip and Arnie Rison, who had been to finals with other teams. Rison had been a champion with the Rochester Royals, I think, in '51. So a lot of former Royals on involved here. So So this series is extremely close series. Boston won games 1, 3, and 6, each by 2 points. And
St. Louis won those games.
I'm sorry. Yes, you're right. St. Louis won those games. And then Boston won 2 blowouts. They won Game 4 by 5 points and Game 7 by 2 points. So very, very close. Margins in 5 of those 7 games. And then both games 1 and 7 were both 2 overtimes, and they both were 125 to 123 scores. St. Louis winning the first game, and the Celtics winning the Game 7. For averaging in the series, Bill Russell had 13.3, 22.9 rebounds, 3.3 assists. Heinsohn had 24 points and 12.6 rebounds. Pettit had 30.1 points and 18.3 rebounds. Those were the standouts there. And this, when we did our Game 7s series last year, we went through every Game 7 in NBA Finals history, and this was chosen as our number 2, I believe, of Finals game. And really just an incredible game.
Real quick before
sure.
I was going to say real quick before you get to Game 7. So it was a really interesting game. So I hate to cut you off.
Go ahead.
Game 7, because Game 7 is fascinating. But Game 3 has these really kind of funny things. So Red Auerbach and
Ben Kerner,
Red Auerbach, who's the Celtics coach, and Ben Kerner, the owner of the Hawks, have this rivalry going on. And so before Game 3, Bob Cousy went up to Red Auerbach and he told Red, he said, the rims they feel a little off. They feel like they're a little high. They're off. And so he doesn't make a big deal of it, but of course, Red Auerbach does, because he already has this rivalry with the St. Louis owner, and he's convinced that Ben Kerner's trying to screw him over, even though of course the Hawks would have to play for half on this rim. And so he has the proverbial janitor come out with a 10-foot long pole to measure the rim height, and Ben Kerner saw this and just was infuriated. He came running down out of the stands and he starts yelling at Red and starts according to Red, starts cursing out Red. And so Red just flies off the handle and roundhoused him in the face. Punched out the owner of the Hawks. They're separated, and the NBA commissioner, who I believe was Maurice Podloff at the time, doesn't suspend either of them for the game. Lets them both stay in the game, or stay in the to watch the game, and ends up fining Red $300 afterwards. And so the game starts off on that note, and then got not even testier during the game. Tommy Heinsohn was probably the offensive star of the series for the Celtics, but in Game 3 he got ejected. He got a technical foul and then got thrown out, and the fans are just booing him. And apparently the St. Louis fans really like to throw eggs on the floor, or eggs at the Celtics when the Celtics would come to town. I really couldn't find when that started, but so they're pelting eggs at old Tommy Heinsohn, and Heinsohn came off the floor and the best description I could give was that he gave the crowd a gesture. So no one, I didn't see anybody specify which gesture, but I'm pretty sure we can draw our own conclusions.
I think we can have a fair guess on that. And the thing is that Ben Kerner and Red Auerbach had a past. Auerbach had been the coach of the Hawks when they were the Tri-Cities Blackhawks. For 1 or 2 seasons, and basically Auerbach left after Kerner broke his promise to not interfere, not make trades, or not do things without without Auerbach's say. So, they'd already kind of had a contentious relationship through that, and then that added obviously drama once they started to play each other in these series continually. And there's another story about Ben Kerner getting into it with Johnny Most, the famous Celtics announcer, where it wasn't during the series, but I think it was a regular season game. I wasn't entirely clear on that, but it was before the game. It was another thing where Kerner, makes some sort of comment about, the fact that, about the fact that Most works for, a so-and-so, throwing a curse word there. And then Most takes exception to that, and then they get into it as well before the game. So, they, people were rowdy back then. There was definitely an added thing to that. You talked about kind of how the crowds would be. They would throw eggs at guys, and there would be some of the most horrible. And St. Louis was notorious for this. Some of the most horrible, racial slurs being thrown at the black players, and St. Louis being a sort of a notorious town for. I believe it was still segregated at the time, and it was one of the reasons why the Hawks, supposedly one of the reasons why the Hawks traded Russell, because they felt like the city wouldn't necessarily support a black player, and then they were one of the last teams to they were the last all-white team to win an NBA Finals, and they were one of the last teams to kind of fully integrate.
Right. No, and you're absolutely right that St. Louis was at the time, it's just a few years after the famous Brown versus the Board of Education decision that desegregates schools. But in many ways, St. Louis is kind of behind the times. And so segregation is still in place. African American players are kind of warned that if you go and play in St. Louis, that you have to either be okay with eating at segregated restaurants, or just don't go there. Right. And so, no, you're absolutely right. And so the fans are throwing eggs. There's the racial animosity. And as you were speaking with Yago Kolis the other day about the rivalry between Wilt and Russell, and how that was this kind of competitor thing. I think here this is more rivalry. There's a lot of hatred and vitriol between the Hawks and Celtics, and between Hawks fans and Celtics fans. So no, this is a very intense rivalry, and it kind of comes out of nowhere. It comes in 57, and for a few years it's pretty hot.
Yeah, and I don't recall there being like a whole lot between the players themselves. I feel like I don't remember that many stories about certainly not that level of animosity. I mean, I'm sure there were instances of things happening, and the games are physical and all of that, but I don't really remember other than maybe some aggressive fouling and sure. What the story that you talked about with Heinsohn. I don't remember a whole lot of that. It was more, I guess it stands out more when it's owners and general manager coaches. I feel like sure. You're less used to seeing those guys get into the scraps than you are the players.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. So it culminates in a big Game 7.
Yes, absolutely, and it probably one of the greatest Game 7s ever. We don't have footage of it, but just the descriptions of it. There's 32 lead changes, 28 ties. We're with about a minute left. Russell has this really dramatic sprinting across the court as Jack Coleman is about to get a layup and get what could end up being the game-winning layup after he had actually won the game in Game 1. But Russell sprints down the court and hits a dramatic chase down block that both Heinsohn and Cousy said was basically Heinsohn said it was the greatest play he'd ever seen, and Cousy said it was the most incredible physical act I ever saw on a basketball court. So at that point, closer to the end, Cousy misses one of two free throws, so the Celtics are in the lead 103-101. However, Pettit is able to coolly sink two free throws in the closing seconds to send the game into overtime. At the end of the first overtime, Coleman hits another clutch jumper, And then with just seconds to go, in the second overtime, Macauley ends up fouling out after he fouls Loskadov, who was, again, more I'm not sure what his free throw percentage exactly was, but he was not necessarily in there for that skill, but more in there for his ability to kind of be a bruiser. He was not necessarily the most offensively productive player, although he shot 70% from free throws that year, so I guess he wasn't terrible at them. But either way, he was able to make both and able to tie it at that point. Or actually, I'm sorry, they gave Boston a 125-123 lead. And then there's this dramatic, not really much they can do, so they had to take the ball inbounds. And Alex Hannum, who is the player coach who barely has played in this series, is the last eligible player on the Hawks bench, decides that he'll toss the ball all the way across the court, bounce it off the backboard in the hope that Bob Pettit could tip it in, which is like this, like 1 in a million. Like, no one thinks that this is like even possible. And incredibly, he's able to bank the pass off of the board, but Pettit isn't quite able to control it, and the tip falls out, and then it's over. And the Celtics have win the series. They shave Russell's beard, as he had pledged to allow them to do if they won, and it was the beginning of an era.
Yeah, and it's that's one play that I would love to have seen on YouTube. From all indications, the Hawks players on the bench are kind of looking at each other like, really? Hannum thinks he's gonna hit the backboard. Afterwards, they're saying things like, we didn't think Hannum could hit a barn from inside, and so he throws the ball, and whether they're covering for Pettit or whether this is real, is that Pettit was kind of stunned that it actually worked, and so the ball bounces right to him, and he's almost he's fumbling it a little bit, and
sure.
But he apparently had a good look from about 12 or 15 feet and just missed it off.
Yeah. I mean, it's just one of those, obviously difficult in the situation to do, and Pettit had 39 and 19 in that game. Russell had 19 and 32. Heinsohn had 37 points, 23 rebounds. And this is also famous or infamous for Cousy shooting 2 of 20 and Sharman shooting 3 of 20 in the game. So it was the young players, the rookies, who were able to kind of take control. Cliff Hagan also had 24 and 16, and Slater Martin had 23, 8 and 7. So just a really a very dramatic situation and great performances, but obviously only one team could win the series. So
right, and so then in the off season, then they're gonna have a rematch in '58, and it's basically the same crew. The Hawks don't make a lot of changes. There's a little shifting. Alex Hannum, the player coach, just becomes coach. But one thing I did notice that was interesting is that Bob Pettit used this finals loss as motivation. So he was had already won the NBA MVP award a few years earlier, and he started working out with a strength coach. He actually started lifting weights at a time when all the coaches and general managers and owners and everybody were telling him not to do it, that he would get muscle bound and not be able to shoot well. Well, he put on he eventually ends up at about 245 pounds, about 30 pounds over where he'd come into the NBA. And he gets a lot stronger and more muscular. So, there's no personnel changes, but you definitely see a kind of a motivated Hawks team coming out in the 57-58 season.
Yeah, I knew about the fact that he was kind of one of the forerunners for weightlifting. I did not realize it was actually after that offseason. Yeah, and it was interesting because the Hawks had just a very tumultuous year that year. They had 3 coaches. Red Holzman was the first, and he was fired after they were 14 and 19. Slater Martin, the point guard, was a player coach for a while, but he sort of hated doing it, and Alex Hannum liked doing it, so they decided to make Alex Hannum the coach there. So they were 34 and 38 that season, but they kind of were able to sort of gel together by the end and were playing really good basketball. In fact, they had to win tiebreakers versus the Lakers and the Pistons just to make it into the playoffs. And then, or I guess that was more of a seeding issue, but because I think all three teams had the same record. So then they beat the Pistons. They swept the Pistons 2-0, and then they swept the Lakers 3-0 to make the finals against the Celtics, who were 44-28 and had swept the Nationals, who had been their longtime rivals. 3-0 in that series. So they really had to come down from a lot farther. And there was a lot of anxiety in Boston during the time of it'd been a decent length wait for the Celtics to accomplish anything. They'd had some, good they'd made the playoffs, but just had, fallen short usually against the Nationals. And there was a lot of angst. It's like, okay, why are the Hawks hanging with them? They shouldn't really, it was clearly Boston had the greater talent, but and a lot of it was just the fact that the Hawks were able to kind of win all of the close games, or most of the close games, other than of course Game 7.
Right, and it was definitely, you're right. It seemed to be the Celtics' time. The Lakers are making some noise, but getting into the playoffs in '58. I read somewhere that in order to get in, they had to beat the Pistons and the Lakers for seeding, and that the Pistons game, the only place they could find was the practice gym at St. Louis University. So they at a noon game they played the Fort Wayne Pistons to get the right then to play against the Lakers. So you get an idea that about how bush league kind of the NBA was in the mid '50s, to play in a college practice gym for a shot at the playoffs.
Yeah, exactly. So. So 58 is the Hawks get their revenge. They win in 6 games. The Hawks were 41-31. They had beaten the Pistons in 5 games to get to the finals. The Celtics, who were 49-23, had beaten the Warriors in 5 games to make the finals. These were both 7-game series. I think this was the first year where that round was a 7-game series instead of a 5-game series. And the Warriors had been the 56 champs. This was pre-Wilt, but they had still had a strong team with Paul Arizin and Neil Johnston kind of as their key players. Tom Gola as well, I believe, was, or I forget I think he was there at that point. So, as you mentioned before, the Celtics were basically the same crew. The only guy really was Sam Jones was a rookie on that team, but he didn't play that much in the finals, only 64 minutes. And as you mentioned, the Hawks really not much of a change other than the Alex Hannum retirement. This is another one where 4 of the 6 games in this series are decided by 3 or fewer points, and all of them are won by the Hawks. It's weird how the Hawks were able to sort of win all those close games. I don't know if it's just luck, if it's just Pettit was able to kind of come through and be, although certainly the Celtics had reliable clutch players. I mean, even though Russell was not a strong free throw shooter and was not the type of offensive player that some of the other players had, they had Cousy and Sharman, who were great free throw shooters. It's just odd that that it kind of kept being that situation where the Hawks would win all the close games.
No, and there doesn't seem to be any reason that I've been able to find. Pettit shoots about 75%. Cliff Hagan's a really good free throw shooter, shooting in the 80s. But
sure, it's really Martin. Strong as well, but.
Right, but it just seems to be one of those things that in '58 it seems to be the Hawks' year, and they won a couple close games in the finals. And in fact, this is the Hawks really got incredibly popular. The owner actually Ben Kerner had to sell closed circuit tickets. He decided to sell tickets at a local movie theater, and they broadcast the game there. So you could, there weren't enough seats in the auditorium in St. Louis, so they simulcast it. So this was getting a lot of attention, especially in St. Louis.
Yeah, and the Hawks had sort of a bad experience in Milwaukee because they moved there, and right after they moved there was the Braves moved from Boston to Milwaukee, so they basically lost the ability to be the major league team in that market, and connected, were able to kind of bounce back and go to St. Louis, and with that success, they actually did get some attention, and obviously St. Louis is a bigger city, so they were able to do pretty well for a while, even though they were only there for 13 years. And the big part of this series is that Russell, he injures his ankle in Game 3 while attempting to block a Bob Pettit shot. ends up missing 2 games in the series and then is really limited in Game 6. Boston actually did win Game 4 so they were able to hold on without him for a little while, but obviously losing Bill Russell, that's a huge loss. I thought it was interesting. Cousy talked about kind of how the Hawks were definitely like the most intense rivalry that he had, and he felt really like Slater Martin. He talked about it a little bit, but as far as like he was really the guy that Cousy kind of had the most trouble with at this point. He was kind of his not quite his kryptonite, but definitely like he was just a stout defender. Martin had been a key cog in the Lakers dynasty of the early 50s, so he had a lot of experience and had a huge championship pedigree, and he was a guy that and this was kind of the last time where he and Martin really matched up with both those guys basically at the height of their powers.
Right. These guys are, as I said, kind of they almost counteract each other or cancel each other out, and so with Russell out, then the Hawks are just able to take over, and the clinching game is Game 6. And the Hawks won by a single point, but really the remarkable thing from the Game 6 win is that Bob Pettit went for 50 points. So Bob Pettit went for 50 points. Hobbled Bill Russell, is able to to not get to some of the balls he probably would have been able to tip or at least alter. And I love this moment. So at the end of the game, there were just a minute or two left in the game, and they came to the bench, and it was almost a moment from the movie Hoosiers where Jimmy Chitwood says, "I'll make it," because Bob Pettit, the teammates all kind of look to him, and he tells them to just give me the ball and get out of the way, and so he took over. He made 18 out of the last 21 points in the fourth quarter for the Hawks, and just really kind of takes St. Louis on his shoulders and leads them to this victory with with Russell hobbled and the other Celtics just not able to keep up.
Yeah, kind of reminiscent of LeBron in that series with the Pistons, taking over I think 29 out of the last 30 or whatever that was, kind of the same idea there. Yeah, and Pettit hits a shot over Russell to give the Hawks a 3-point lead. Then Heinsohn hits free throws to cut it to 1 with 16 seconds left. Pettit then is able to rebound a Slater Martin miss for a tap in to steal it. He's been able to jump over a bunch of different Celtics in a crowd and is able to tap it in. Sort of a little bit of a similar type, where he was not able to tap it in the year before. He's able to tap that in and seal it and get 50 points, which is kind of a magical number at the time. That was the finals record at the time. That may be a game 7 record still. I'm not 100% sure about that.
It is, yeah. Well, it's a clinching game record. So it's the most points ever in a game that ended the finals.
Okay, well there you go. Yeah, yeah. Well, that would definitely be a game 7 record.
I double checked that
yes,
one.
Yep. Yeah. So, but yes, that is it was game 6. I'm sorry, you're right. So right. A final game of the finals record, but that's still very impressive. Sharman had 26, Heinsohn had 23. Russell only had 8 points in the in that game. Obviously, as we talked about, limited with injury. So 59, the Hawks lose to the Lakers. They're upset. Lakers are still in Minneapolis. It's Elgin Baylor's rookie year. Even though the Hawks were a stronger regular season team, they ended up losing. Boston sweeps the Lakers and wins back-to-back titles. So the next Hawks Celtics series is in 1960. It again goes 7 games, although this was pretty dominant effort by Boston. Although again, the Hawks in this case didn't really, they did win the close games, but there weren't that many close games in the series. It was more of a dud of a series. There's only one game that had a pretty close margin. The others were 4 big blowouts won by the Celtics, and the Hawks winning 2 games by 10 and 1 by 3.
Right. Yeah, no, it was a close series. When the Hawks won and when the Celtics won, they tended to blow them out.
Yes, yeah, and that, which is honestly kind of the MO for most of the series. But pretty good evidence that the Celtics were the better team, and they obviously won 3 of the series. But just interesting how that worked out. And the Celtics, of course, had plenty of luck during their time as we've talked about on other episodes. Russell had a 10-0 record in Game 7s and, won almost every close, important NBA game during his career. So, certainly the Celtics benefited from luck in a lot of ways as well. But in this rivalry, it seems like the Hawks generally benefited from, they got the coin tosses during these series. But
sure.
In this case, the Hawks were 46-21. They'd won a rematch with the Lakers 4-3 to get here in the division series. The Celtics won 59 games, which was a record at the time in the 75-game series, 75-game season. Excuse me, not a 75-game series. That would be that might be hard to follow. The Celtics beat the Warriors 4-2. This was the first ever Wilt Russell series, which we'll get into a little bit more detail in another show. Of course, 2 years later, the Celtics and the Hawks have changed a little bit, one more than the other. The Celtics had Gene Conley, who also was a pitcher for the Milwaukee Braves for a lot of his career, but he also played basketball and did it fairly well as a backup big. Casey Jones, who was Bill Russell's roommate at the University of San Francisco, had joined the team as well, was a great defensive guard, and Russell, Cousy, Heinsohn, Ramsey, Sharman, and Sam Jones are the key Celtics at this point. All of them, of course, have been on the team for a little while. And what about the Hawks? Who were the key players for the Hawks?
Well, the Hawks had, and you mentioned this earlier, but they had such tremendous turnover in coaching. 13 seasons in St. Louis, and they had 10 different coaches. So this is no different in for the 1960 season. They had convinced Ed Macauley to become the coach. He had retired and kind of been told that he was going to be the new head coach. They replaced Macauley in the front line with Clyde Lovellette, who was he'd played alongside George Mikan with the Lakers, and had played in Boston as well.
Yeah,
or
he was going to play in Boston in the
correct,
future.
Right,
Yes,
right.
He
ends up with Boston.
Yeah, he just recently passed away. He was the first player to win the NCAA, NBA, and Olympic titles. So
was he Lovellette?
Yeah.
So he's added, and so they have this front line that's just stellar, and it's probably, again I'm spitballing, but you could, and it was argued at the time that it was the greatest front line in NBA history, and of course now you obviously can make arguments for the 1980s Celtics or whatever, but this front line of Clyde Lovellette and Cliff Hagan and Bob Pettit were called by the team owner, called them the Unmatchables. Yeah. And also held this big press conference that they were the $100,000 front line. And then he has this big press conference to announce this $100,000 front line, and Lovellette and Hagan are standing in the back, and one of them starts saying, hey, how much are you making, and how much you? Well, they decided that Pettit was making at least half of the $100,000 if they were actually a $100,000 front line.
Nice. But
so they add Lovellette. They have this really talented, bruising, front line that can certainly match the Celtics. And the problem is going to be, again, with the Celtics dominating in the 1960 finals, is going to be that the backcourt just can't keep up. Slater Martin is near the end of his career. In fact, this is his last hurrah. He's done after the 1960 finals.
Yeah, and he had actually been injured earlier on in the postseason, so he didn't even play in these finals.
Right, and so they the Hawks always had problems finding backcourt help. They actually had traded for Cy Green, who was the guy who picked in front of Bill Russell in 1956. They added him to try to shore up their backcourt, but that didn't take either. So they added some pieces. Again, Ed Macaulay's the new coach. Clyde Lovellette adds to that Unmatchables front line, and Cy Green tries to provide backcourt help. But really, the Celtics were a machine by this point.
Yeah. The other key addition, probably Larry Faust, who was he was aging, but he had been one of the best big men of the 1950s. A forward for the Detroit, or Fort Wayne Pistons, I guess, then Detroit, became Detroit. He may have left by then, but either way, he was another guy who definitely added. They certainly had some good front court depth that season for sure. Yeah, it was another. Even though it did go 7 games, it was not really a season. Ed Macauley later admitted that basically he thought the Hawks had no chance in the series, and they're facing against the team that had the best record ever in NBA history, so that'd be a little dispiriting.
Right.
So
yeah,
especially without Slater Martin, again hit the last guy. Cousy said, Slater was the only one I used to call for help on. I used to tell my big people to set picks as often as they felt like it, just to get him off him. And in the series, Russell had 16.7 points, 24.9 rebounds, 3 assists per games. Heinsohn with 22.4 points, 9.7 rebounds. Ramsey with 18.4 points and 7.3 rebounds. Pettit, great statistical series, 25.7 points, 14.9 rebounds, 3.6 assists per game. And then Cliff Hagan with 23.6 and 10.1. So, as we mentioned, Cliff Hagan keeps contributing. Probably the second best player for the Hawks. In this era, during the years that Pettit there, I think Hagan probably clearly is his best teammate during that time.
Yeah, and he had a killer hook shot. He could shoot it from up to he claimed from 15 to 17 feet out. He'd throw up the hook shot, and he had actually been a center in college with the Kentucky Wildcats, and his first coach tried to convert him in the pros to a guard, and that didn't take real well, going from center in college to guard in the NBA. But he really kind of hit his stride playing alongside Pettit.
Sure.
Throwing in those hook shots.
Yeah, and Pettit was another guy who he played center in college, but he had to kind of reconstitute himself as a forward, and he really had to learn how to become a strong jump shooter. And he was really, one of the first bigger jump shooters in the NBA to, really have success with the jump shot, which is really coming into vogue by the late 50s and being used in a widespread way.
Yeah, and if you watch, there's not that much film on Pettit, but in his interviews, he would shoot a jump shot, but he would jump toward the basket, and he was amazing at drawing fouls. He went to the line, 10 or 12 times a game. So. Hit 75% of them. So he would get 7 or 8 points a game just from jumping towards the basket on jump shots and drawing fouls, and he was tough around the rim. So, the combination of him being able to shoot jump shots and Hagan being able to shoot those hooks or jump shots from 12 to 15 feet, that was putting pressure on Russell, at least, to come out and defend that. So they were a good combination.
Yeah, absolutely. We might as well ask it now since we had a question regarding it. Pettit belongs in the top 5 power forwards all-time discussion. Asking this question, Jason Palumbo at Double Dribble. Sorry, it's cut off. I forget his.
It's Double Dribble
WP. Yes. It's cut off my tweet deck. Excuse me, Jason. I apologize for that. Asking if Pettit belongs in the top power forwards all-time discussion and how high. I would say that extremely high.
Well, okay, so ESPN just did their top players at every position, and they had him ranked 7th.
Yeah.
And it's you're
tough.
Arguing different eras, and really until the 1990s. He was the undisputed best power forward of all time, with some people probably advocating for Dolph Schayes maybe or Elvin Hayes, but really he was it until the Charles Barkley, Karl Malone, and then the Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, Dirk Nowitzki. So he's in that conversation. I think that power forward's really a tough position to rank or to differentiate, especially across when you're talking about eras 30 or 40 years different.
Yeah.
I did not knowing Rich wasn't going to be on. I did do a very little bit of statistical stuff. Career win shares for power forwards. Pettit is actually 8th behind Karl Malone, Tim Duncan, Dirk Nowitzki, Kevin Garnett, Charles Barkley, and Dolph Schayes. But if you do win shares per 48, he had a pretty short career.
Yeah.
And so he's second to Charles Barkley.
Yeah. I would. I could see him as high as 3rd, but probably closer to like 5th. I would say. like he's definitely behind Duncan and Malone because of longevity and just how great Malone was into his late 30s. Some of the older players, they lasted a long time, but they weren't they weren't necessarily strong players after age 35 like Malone clearly was. So yeah, that would be around the place that I would put him. Again, it's a tough comparison. It's a tough a lot of things to weigh, and we're not the biggest fans of ranking players, but that's kind of generally the spot that I would kind of throw him in.
I mean, by his last season, 32, he's his career down, so he can make an argument. He was on top. He retired when he was ready, and at 32, he was clearly had some injury concerns and played longer than I think we downgrade his career because he's struggling at 34, 35.
Right, that's a fair point. Yeah, and it was extremely rare for someone to play more than 11 or 12 seasons up until Dolph Schayes was really the only guy up until the mid 70s when guys would start to kind of play 15, 16 years or so, and then and once Kareem retired, he broke all those records. But but yeah, there was nobody play. You want to penalize him. I mean, I'm not gonna. The fact that Karl Malone played 20 years and was awesome for almost all that time, or 19 years or whatever, I can't hold that against him and not, consider that when comparing him to Pettit, but it's not like Pettit, his longevity was perfectly, typical for his time, which also has to be considered. So Game 7 of the series was a pretty dominant effort by the Celtics. They won 122-103. Russell had 22 and 35. Cousy had 19 and 14 assists. Pettit had 22 and 14. As a team, Boston out-rebounded St. Louis 83-47. So
much of that powerful St. Louis front line, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, where were you guys? Yeah, I mean, Pettit did his part. I don't know where Lovellette and Hagan and Faust and all those guys were. So I think Faust may have been hurt also in this series, if I'm not mistaken. I know he didn't play that much in the series, so perhaps that had something to do with it. But he was older too. So, but yeah, that is basically it for the 1960 finals. So we get to their the final year of their rivalry, the 1961 finals, and this is a pretty much a walkover by the Celtics, 4-1. The Celtics were 57-22. They had beaten the Nationals that year, 4-1. A lot of those Nationals actually ended up being 76ers that the Celtics would face later on in the 60s. So. Funny that was the bulk of that group. The Hawks were 51-28. So this, I believe, is the smallest record disparity between the two teams that they played in the finals. Only 6-game difference, and they beat the Lakers, who had moved to Los Angeles, 4-3. This was Jerry West's rookie year.
Right. Yeah, and Elgin scored 35 points a game. I mean, that was a good Lakers team they beat.
Yeah.
To get there.
Yeah, and young, obviously, but yeah, the Celtics were about to be in 7 finals during the for the rest of the decade, and then was it 3 more in the 70s? So.
Right.
So that was a obviously very the foundation of a not quite a dynasty because they only won 1 title, but an extraordinary accomplished team. So this was Bill Sharman's final season. He was kind of the first guy of the early Celtics really key players to retire. They were going to start. It was going to be Cousy pretty soon, and Heinsohn, and a number of guys up until, of course, Russell and Sam Jones in the final season. The Celtics were pretty much the same as they had been. They had added Satch Sanders. He was kind of the key contributor, a really good defensive player and rebounder. The Hawks, not quite as much transition as we're used to, but they definitely had some new pieces.
Well, they added, really their big addition was their new point guard. They drafted Lenny Wilkens to replace the departed Slater Martin, and
yes.
So just the time that they managed to hit on a backcourt player, their one good backcourt player
had left. So Lenny Wilkens though steps right in and almost immediately contributes to the to them getting to the finals.
Yeah, and they were it took some acceptance for Lenny to be accepted as a rookie on the team and in a new environment, but he did well. The Hawks were also a team where there've always kind of been rumors, and I've never really known that much about specifics. Maybe having studied them a little bit more, as far as the there were racial cliques on a lot of teams in the 50s and 60s as more black players were added to the league, and the Celtics generally were pretty harmonious in that front, but my understanding is the Hawks were not as much.
They had some problems. When Lenny Wilkens came into the league, his local restaurants refused him service. Friends told him not to date white girls, and neighbors they warned him of neighbors poisoning his dogs. Like it was really rough for Lenny Wilkens coming into the league. And so there's not a clique when there's such a small minority. Lenny Wilkens was one of only one or two Hawks players. In fact, the racial animosity on the team really gets worse, or really I should say changes really the next season, starting in '62 and then the rest of their time in St. Louis. Though it obviously kind of starts when Wilkens arrives in '61. Right.
So the Hawks were now also coached by Paul Seymour, who Ben Kerner had hired during the 1960 playoffs, but didn't bother to tell, even though they had made the finals. I guess them making the finals was a bit of a surprise. So that was kind of how that uncomfortable situation happened, but didn't tell Ed Macauley about it until the series was over, even though there were rumors about it. So not the best handled situation by old Ben. And also forward center Woody Salisbury was the other kind of big addition to the Hawks. But this was another the Celtics won really big in games 1 and 4. 2 and 5 were closer, but it was 8 and 9 points, so not exactly that close. The Hawks won. The only game they won was a close game by 4 points in game 3. So one thing that maybe we don't appreciate today is the fact that the Hawks had to play game 1 in Boston one night after beating LA in St. Louis. So the travel schedule did them no favors.
No, and going from that tough LA series to Boston right away, and then the Celtics won big in game 1 and kind of set the tone for the series at that point.
Yeah. In the there's not a whole lot like the other series have more written about them. This one it's kind of harder to find stuff, at least for me. Russell averaged 17.6, 28.8, and 4.4 in the series. Cousy had 19.8, 5 rebounds and 10.6 assists. Hagan 29.4, 11.8, and 4.4. Pettit with 28.4, 16.4, and 3. Hagan actually kind of outproduced Pettit in the series. Interestingly enough, I guess on the boards Pettit still won, but he was kind of he performed well in the series, at least production wise. Game 5 was 121-112. The Celtics win. Russell led all scorers with 30. Pettit had 24 and Hagan had 26. I couldn't find official rebound or assist totals in the box score. The Compendium of Professional Basketball book, which is terrific for anyone who can get their hands on it. It says that Russell had 38 rebounds, so I will trust it. So 30 and 38 is a pretty good game.
That's not a bad clinching game.
Yeah. And, at this point, obviously, Russell has kind of firmly established that he is really, it was pretty evident right away, but he really is able to kind of cement like, okay, this is definitely your team. He's by far bearing the heaviest burden in minutes and in defense. And, he's already earned, a couple of MVPs at this point, and he won a second MVP in 61, as a matter of fact. So he'd won 2 in 4 seasons, and then was runner-up in 59 and 60. So and in fact would win a total of 5 MVPs, would come in second twice, would come in third twice, and come in fourth twice. So, and then his first year he came in 7th. So,
yeah, not a bad start.
Yes. So, so yeah. Anything else regarding this rivalry or regarding the Hawks or even the Celtics that stands out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to touch briefly on the. It's kind of a time of transition for the Celtics or for the Hawks rather after they lose the series in '61. They had a really rough season. The next season had 3 coaches within the span of the season. Finished with 29 wins, and so after being competitive year after year, they suddenly have a high draft pick, and they began reshaping their roster in a way that would really kind of transition them from St. Louis to Atlanta. They drafted in 1962. They drafted Zelmo Beatty, who ends up being an all-star center for them before going to the ABA. In the next couple seasons, they traded for Bill Bridges, who was a strong power forward. They drafted Lou Hudson, who ends up becoming an all-star swingman, and Joe Caldwell, another outstanding guard forward. And so they really have this transition from being this dominant, this white team located in St. Louis to by the time they moved to Atlanta in I think it's '68, they moved to Atlanta. They were almost entirely dominated by African American stars. And as we've talked about, St. Louis was not the most tolerant, the most tolerant community in the mid '60s, and this is in the midst of civil rights with Martin Luther King Jr. and with Malcolm X and with Bill Russell becoming more outspoken, Muhammad Ali. Kind of these athletes are becoming more outspoken about race, and so the Hawks get this backlash almost where attendance drops. They're still doing really well as a team, with that one exception. They still are competitive with the San Francisco Warriors and the Los Angeles Lakers in the Western Division, but the fans just don't care anymore. They had rallied around Bob Pettit, and when Pettit retires in 65, the fans just didn't care, and so a combination of this predominantly African American team in St. Louis, and the fact that they had kind of been spoiled. In a way, it reminds me of Oklahoma City in a way. So when Oklahoma City got the Thunder, they added a team, or Kevin Durant came with him, and they did really well, and they're still doing well. And you have to wonder if that fan support will still, or how strong that fan support will be after Durant and or Westbrook leave, whether through free agency or retirement, but whether that will continue. And so the St. Louis Hawks had this great success. Fans had gotten spoiled. They stopped competing for titles. Their best players now are African American, and fan interest waned. And so I think it's '68, they're sold to Atlanta, and the St. Louis Hawks are no more.
Yeah, and '68 was actually their strongest year in St. Louis. They, the regular season year, they won 56 games, and had been able to kind of, like you mentioned, they had 3 pretty strong years after that downturn in '62, toward the end of Pettit's career. Then they, a couple years of just sort of being mediocre, and then their first few years in Atlanta, actually the first 3 years in Atlanta, they had strong regular seasons. They made the division finals 6 times in 9 years. So they were always kind of on the cusp, usually falling to, I think in almost all those instances, except for maybe one, they lost to the Lakers. Probably in '67 they lost to the Warriors. So it's a tough. It was obviously a tough thing for them to. To kind of crack that foundation, and maybe it's hard to know whether, if circumstances had changed, if they would have survived, if they would have been able to make it kind of in St. Louis. But then again, they've been part of Atlanta. Not that Atlanta's the hottest NBA market by any means, but I lived in Atlanta for 4 years. That's how, in my 20s, that's how I became an Atlanta Hawks fan. So if they hadn't moved to Atlanta and I hadn't had a chance to really recapture my NBA fandom through the Hawks, I may not have turned into a NBA superfan, and this podcast may not exist. So
like butterfly wings, starting in 1965 with the Warriors having some coaching problems.
Yeah.
Now Jason's a basketball fan.
There you go. So thanks for being racist, St. Louis. Wait, no, I'm sorry. Sorry, that's not. I didn't mean that. I apologize. No. Anyway, hopefully I didn't terribly offend some people from that with that comment, but maybe we'll edit that one out in post. Anything else that we should talk about, Adam, before we go?
No, I think that this was it was a lot of fun to come on here and talk about the Hawks and Celtics rivalry. I think that it's often overshadowed by the rivalry that immediately succeeds it, because it's a transition where the Hawks and Lakers are kind of vying for that spot in the West, and the Lakers kind of gain the advantage then in the mid '60s, and the Hawks fade and the Lakers rise, and brings about a whole new and far better known rivalry.
Yes, absolutely. So, which we'll have a show on that one as well. We're kind of planning to go through the major rivalries that the Celtics had in the playoffs in a format just like this. So that'll be fun to talk about, and to dig into other aspects of Bill Russell's career as well. We have a lot of cool things planned for WrestleMania, so if you are enjoying it, please let us know. You can get us on Twitter or Facebook at Over and Back NBA. We also, it would be great if you would check us out on hardwoodparoxysm.com, which is the home of our podcast. Also, you can find us on or if you would give us a rating and review on iTunes or Stitcher, whatever you prefer to use. We would love that. That would help people let people know about the show and spread the word and all that good stuff, and makes us feel good to have compliments thrown our way. So anyway, until next time, thanks for listening, and we'll be back again soon.